Good evening. First, I would like to thank the Illinois Academy of Criminology and Loyola. Dean, thank you for your kind reception. I especially want to thank Professor Ed Mogul, who was very persistent in ensuring my attendance here. And I thank you all for attending and for the very kind invitation to speak with you this evening. It's truly an honor for me to be with you here tonight. In a democratic society, trust between law enforcement agencies and the people they protect and serve is essential to the stability of our communities, the integrity of the criminal justice system, and the effective delivery of policing services. The fear of oppressive and discriminatory law enforcement we've seen can be as debilitating as the fear of crime itself. This has become abundantly clear in observing the ongoing events around the country and the public demonstrations that have been taken up in a number of communities nationwide. It was in the wake of several controversial events that the Obama administration announced a number of new steps aimed at strengthening relationships between local law enforcement and the communities that they serve. One of those key components was the formation of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The task force was formally established and the members were appointed, including me, by executive order on December 18th of 2014. Just file that date away for a minute. The task force faced an ambitious goal and an equally ambitious timeline. We needed to examine the entire range of important issues involved in contemporary policing in order to identify best practices and otherwise make recommendations to the President and his administration on how policing practices can promote effective crime reduction while building public trust. After reading the report and asking us a few questions, the President made the following announcement. This report is going to contain a series of very specific, concrete, common sense efforts for us to build trust. It will be good for police and it will be good for the communities involved. And as a consequence, it will be good for the country. Everybody wants our streets safe and everybody wants to make sure that laws are applied fairly and equitably. Nobody, by the way, wants that more than law enforcement themselves. I was keenly interested in hearing from some of our law enforcement representatives who talked about how important it is for police to feel as if the community supports them, because they got into law enforcement to serve and protect, not to be viewed as some external force. And this is my favorite part of what he said. But unfortunately, sometimes policies, politics, politicians put law enforcement in an untenable position. You probably have never heard that reported. But that's available online too, because he said it during a press availability as we were giving him the report. That's on C-SPAN if you want to look it up. Of course, I couldn't agree more with what he said. I think that if you read the report, you will find that it provides a remarkably honest commentary with strong and very clear recommendations on virtually every major issue facing law enforcement today, including things like the use of force, training, de-escalation, new technologies, social media, and the future of community policing, officer training and education, and officer safety and wellness. While I don't have time to share all 60 recommendations with you tonight, and I wouldn't, don't worry, I'm not going to try. I want to highlight just a few that I think may be of interest to you. First is that the task force calls upon all law enforcement agencies to adopt procedural justice as the guiding principle for internal and external policies and practices, to guide their interactions with their rank and file members and with citizens they serve. The task force also urges the profession to embrace a guardian mindset to build public trust and legitimacy. As Plato wrote, and the task force quotes, "In a republic that honors the core of democracy, the greatest amount of power is given to those called guardians." The task force also recommends that the law enforcement agencies should acknowledge the role of policing in past and present injustice and discrimination, and how it is a hurdle to the promotion of community trust. Both of these themes emerged at our very first listening session, and they emerged over and over and over again at every turn throughout the process. As some of you may be aware, FBI Director James Comey gave a widely publicized speech in early February of this year, before our interim report was actually delivered to the President. In it, he spoke in a very candid, non-judgmental way about the existence of implicit bias in his agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and in policing generally. And he kind of described it like this: a mental shortcut becomes almost irresistible and maybe even rational by some lights. The two young black men on one side of the street look like so many others the officer has locked up. Two white men on the other side of the street, even in the same clothes, do not. The officer doesn't make the same unconscious association about the two white guys, whether that officer is white or black. And that drives different behavior. It's clear that a key component to the practice of fair and impartial policing is built on understanding and acknowledging human biases, both explicit and implicit. Jennifer Eberhard of Stanford University testified before the task force, and she said, bias is not limited to so-called bad people, and it certainly is not limited to police officers. The problem is a widespread one that arises from history, from culture, and from racial inequalities that still pervade our society and are especially salient in the context of criminal justice. What is also clear is that bias exists in virtually every profession, from the law to medicine to academia. But we know, based on some very solid research, that bias can be successfully countered by education and training. The task force examined and recommended several ways to attack this challenge, including excellent training on bias, which has been developed by the National Holocaust Museum. Another example can be found in Nashville, Tennessee. In the Nashville Police Department, which has received some very positive response recently to a program it started in cooperation with Nashville's Public Library, which has a civil rights room. So right now, on the same block where Nashville police officers carried a young, does everybody know who John Lewis is, Congressman John Lewis? Mm-hmm. Tremendous figure in the civil rights movement. So right now, on the same block where in Nashville, where Nashville police officers carried John Lewis by his hands and feet to a paddy wagon for daring to take a seat at a whites-only lunch counter decades ago, police recruits are learning lessons about the fraud history between law enforcement and black Americans. This type of training is essential, in my opinion. This training is essential because I think if we can't honestly and earnestly acknowledge history, we can never get beyond it. The task force also recommends that law enforcement agencies should collaborate with community members to develop strategies in communities and neighborhoods disproportionately affected by crime. A compelling example of this practice can be found in Los Angeles, in the neighborhood, in those of you familiar with the Watts. Have you ever heard of the Watts area in Los Angeles? It's a location of great civil unrest during the civil rights movement, and many times, I think most recently during the Rodney King protests. In Watts, the LAPD, in cooperation with the Advancement Project, has created LAPD's Community Safety Partnership. And as part of that partnership, the Los Angeles Police Department has assigned 45 police officers to 3 areas within Watts. And all 45 of those officers will be assigned there for 5 years. And during that time, the focus of their assignment is not necessarily law enforcement. Their assignment is to create partnerships, create relationships, to hear the community and see what they need, and then work together to make those things happen. It's projects like that that have the potential also to address another very hotbed issue in policing and law enforcement, and that's the challenge that departments face in hiring a diverse workforce. And you know, one piece of testimony I was struck by as a member of the task force was provided by Sherilyn Eiffel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. And you know, she was asked a question by one of the members of the task force. I don't think it was me, but it might have been. And I'm not saying that to be ingratiating. I really don't remember if it was me or not. But the question was, how do we get, how can you help us as the head of the NAACP, and how can the NAACP as an organization help us to recruit more diversity into our police departments? And she pointed out, you know, that's a tall order. It's pretty difficult to do, because by the time a kid is 17 years old, in some neighborhoods, they've been stopped and frisked at least a dozen times. And that doesn't make a 17-year-old want to become a police officer too much. And so she said, and she's been very critical of law enforcement over the years, by the way. She said the challenge is to transform the idea of policing in communities among young people into something that they see as being an honorable profession, a desirable profession for them to get into. So obviously the task force, you know, recommends that law enforcement agencies strive to create a workforce that contains people of great diversity, including race, gender, language, life experience, cultural background, and so forth. And I'm winding down, I promise. What? Okay. You okay? All right, okay. So what also carries through so many of the recommendations is that community policing emphasizes working with neighborhood residents to co-produce public safety. And that law enforcement agencies should work with community residents to identify problems and collaborate on implementing solutions. It's a co-production, it's a partnership. If it's not a co-production and a partnership, it's an imposition. And I think we've seen many examples of imposition not working. Dolores Jones Brown of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice probably said it best. She said, neighborhood policing provides an opportunity for police departments to do things with residents in the co-production of public safety rather than doing things to or for them. Good policing is not just about the behavior and tactics of police. It's also about civic engagement and capacity of communities to improve their own neighborhoods, their quality of life, and their sense of safety and well-being. I think the general idea is that public safety is everyone's responsibility. And managing public safety requires collaboration across agencies, across sectors, and communities. Now, I am going to wrap up my remarks because, one, I suspect you may be tired of listening to me talk. And two, I hope we'll have some good questions. And I look forward to answering your questions to the extent that I'm able. Anybody figure out how many days we had to produce this report yet? 57. Okay.
74.
Well, I think 57's closer. Let me just put it this way. I wasn't home a lot between January 1st and mid-March. So if you asked my family, they would say, what'd you say, 70?
74.
They would say 74. I would say it was like 80, but it felt like we had to do it in like 56. So at any rate, working on the task force was an incredible honor for me and for my task force colleagues. And while every task force member and every witness brought their own perspective to the table, my sense is that all of us agree that individuals are more likely to obey the law when they trust that those who enforce it will treat them with dignity and respect, and regardless of what they look like, where they live, or whom they love. Finally, I want to just share the opinion that was expressed by the COPS director, Ron Davis, in Springfield just last week. And he said he felt a profound optimism about the progress we're making and the progress we are poised to make in ensuring that our communities are safer places for everyone, where a culture of trust between police and the communities they are sworn to serve and protect will grow over time. I thank you for the opportunity to share this hope and optimism with all of you tonight.
I'm very happy to be here, and frankly, from all that was said so far, I think that policing is finding its way back to its intended and ancestral mission. I was asked to speak on constitutional policing, which is not quite so timely in the sense of being to the point of a present task force or a present strategy, but more to set it all into a context. And in that regard, it might surprise everyone. I'm sure when you think about it, it's sort of obvious, but no one probably thinks about it, that at the time that the United States Constitution, or even for that matter, the Illinois Constitution, was adopted and ratified, I mean the original Illinois Constitution, there was not such a thing as a municipal police department. In fact, the only municipal police department in the Western world that there was at that time was in Paris, established by Louis XIV. And other than that, there was, in the Anglo-American tradition, there was no municipal or metropolitan police force until 1829. And so, in a sense, it may seem strange to talk about constitutional policing when at the time that the Constitution was drafted and ratified, there was, in fact, no municipal police department. But there was policing of a sort. And first of all, we should realize that a Constitution is a structure, a skeleton for a society, and that it has in it values and objectives and concepts and principles that the society intends to live by, and how those are applied will change from time to time and circumstance to circumstance, but the basic Constitution, unless it is amended, remains the same and virtually timeless. And so at the time that the Constitution of the United States was ratified, and of course we are talking about the Constitution of the United States, I could say, well, what Constitution am I to be talking about? The Illinois Constitution or the federal Constitution? Because in Illinois we live under both. Luckily, the conversation is simplified by the fact that the Illinois Supreme Court has adopted what they call the lockstep doctrine, so that if there is a constitutional issue that the federal Constitution covers in policing, essentially the Fourth Amendment and Due Process Amendment, it will adopt the same interpretation. So we can go right back to the federal Constitution without worrying about the Illinois Constitution. But at the time the Illinois Constitution was adopted, it has terms that would allow expansion and contraction in the joints. You know, we talk all the time about interstate commerce, but interstate commerce at the time that the United States Constitution was adopted was quite a different thing than it is today. They didn't know about the web or about any of the developments that have occurred, the speed of transportation, the train, the truck, and so forth. So the net result is that we still have the Interstate Commerce Clause. Its basic mission is to protect commerce against parochial interests and parochial interference, but how it's applied varies. Well, it's the same with the Fourth Amendment. It talks about reasonableness. And reasonableness in one age may be different than another age. The principle, the objective, the value stays the same, but how it's applied can change. Another thing about our Constitution is we talk about it being a written Constitution. But the reality is that it would take a tome, probably of several pounds, if not tons, to actually put everything in the Constitution if it were to be strictly adhered to as a written Constitution. We know that our Constitution covers most of the territory, and with certain things it tells you who and how, but with other things it expresses things in a sense that are to be outside of the Constitution. For instance, the Constitution explicitly says in Amendment 9 that what it says in terms of the Bill of Rights does not disparage or deny other rights that are not stated in the Bill of Rights. Now, the Supreme Court has yet to determine if, in fact, there are any other rights and what they may be, but the fact is that there's actual evidence within the Constitution that it wasn't necessarily supposed to be so exclusive as to deny anything else that wasn't stated there. And so we also know that the Constitution is a little bit like an oral conversation. We know that although we speak to one another in words, there's a lot of nonverbal communication going on. And the historical context in which the Constitution is adopted has something to do with what's in the Constitution, how we understand the Constitution. After all, the Fourth Amendment is talking about things that have to do with policing. And yet there's nothing in the Constitution itself, in a positive sense, about policing. So we know that they were aware that there were going to be some sort of law enforcement, not necessarily policing in the technical sense, but some sort of law enforcement. And there's a Bill of Rights there, but nonetheless, it doesn't cover law enforcement as such. And so we know that, again, it's something broader, and the same with the historical heredity of the Constitution. Because another thing we should remember is although we talk in general terms about a revolutionary war, the fact is that it wasn't so much a revolution, it was really a war of independence, which is a more accurate way of talking about the war, because we were very proud of what England had given us. We were very proud of representative government. We were very proud of the Magna Carta. We were very proud of the Bill of Rights of 1689. And even a recent decision that bore directly on the Fourth Amendment, Entick versus Carrington, which had dealt with search and seizure in England and is cited by the United States Supreme Court, so forth. So we never really left the English legal heritage or political heritage totally behind. We altered it, modified it to some degree to suit our needs, but we were very proud of the English background. And in fact, in Illinois, there's a statute, and it was a statute when it was an Illinois territory as well, that said the common law of Illinois accepts all, as part of the common law of Illinois, accepts all decisions, statutes, except for a couple of named exceptions, of England up through the fourth reign of James I, or 1607. So that's part of our common law by statute in Illinois. So we didn't leave that behind. It wasn't truly a revolution. And that's important because it bears directly on the issue of law enforcement. England had a long history, obviously, of society and of law enforcement. And since we didn't have any municipal law department until the Metropolitan was established in London in 1829, what was law enforcement like? How did it occur? And in about 800, the 9th century, at least, perhaps earlier, it was kinship policing. People lived in family groups and in clan groups, and if someone committed an offense, even murder, against another individual, it was either resolved within the family and within the clan, usually by the payment of money called weregild, or if it was between clans and between families, it was arranged between the families, again largely by the payment of money, which today may be a wrongful death action, but it was then sort of the total way that it was remedied. Then that's pretty much the way law enforcement went until the 13th century. In the 13th century, there was a lot of action, 2 or 3, 4 statutes, ordinances, and so forth that established a constable, established watches. In fact, there's a statute of 1285 that provided that if you had a borough, that you had to have 6 people from the inhabitants drawn to man each gate at night. And if you were in a city or a village, it went down from there, from 6 to 4 or whatever. And these were the people. And it had an interesting provision that I know Ed very much likes, which was that if there was a stranger that was seen approaching the city at sundown, you would arrest him. And you would hold him until the next morning. And if there was no suspicion, by the next morning he was released. And that was the way they kept the peace, essentially, and law enforcement by statute and by arms and so forth. The duty of the constable or the duty of the shire reeve. Now, the shire reeve is a very ancient, goes back to 800, 900. And if you think about it and slur the words, that's where we get sheriff. The shire reeve became the sheriff. And the shire reeve was like the sheriff, but he was only one officer. And so if someone was threatening breach of the king's peace, if there was going to be some sort of major problem, he would raise the alarm, and he could call forth all men above the age of 15 to support him in enforcing the law and putting down whatever was the breach of peace. And then later on, the constable could do the same thing. And we get from that the posse comitatus. Everyone knows about the posse in the West, in the American West, where it goes way, way back. And it started out as being a term of German origin, Anglo-Saxon, dealing with, again, family law enforcement. And then it becomes the shire reeve, or the sheriff, or the constable could call out a posse to enforce the law, so that he would have people to back him. He wouldn't be alone. Or people could not involve the sheriff. They could raise what was called a hue and cry. If someone stole from me, I could shout, "He stole from me, I need help," and other people would come, and that would be the hue and cry. And that's basically the state of law in England until basically 1829. In the United States, what was then the settlements or the colonies, in the settlements, everyone was responsible for law enforcement. There was no special law enforcement agent. In Jamestown or whatever, in the very earliest days, everyone had that responsibility. It was a community responsibility, and that's really what I'm trying to drive through home with this history, is that community is the center of law enforcement. The fact that the police exist, there's sort of a specialized group within the community now that can do this full time. We don't have leisure anymore to do it full time. But the center is not the police as such. The center is the community, and we have to keep our eye on the community. Well, in the colonies, Boston was the first to establish a constable in about 1631. And then Boston moved through its to about 1635, they had an actual watch. Again, it was mostly volunteers, but they actually had an organized watch. After that, New York followed, and then finally Philadelphia in 1705 divided the city of Philadelphia into watch districts. But again, no professional police department, and the watches were largely at night. At one point there was a day watch, but basically these were people who were volunteers largely. So we come down then to 1829. Sir Robert Peel establishes the Metropolitan Police Department in London, hence the name Bobby, which we all know about the Bobbies. And that was because in London, and then shortly thereafter in the United States, the agrarian, very more or less quiet life was changing to congested, high-density cities that had a lot of industrial revolution. The Industrial Revolution had crime. There was a certain amount of political turmoil. And if anyone saw The Gangs of New York, the movie, you realize that about 1845 or so, there were gangs of white youths, primarily white youths, who were rioting and attacking immigrants and blacks that were in the towns like New York and so forth. So that was the reason that the police departments were found to be necessary. And so about 1835, I think it was, Boston had one, then New York had one about 1840 something. And then they began to fall in quick succession, and Chicago had its first actual police department in 1855. Prior to that, Chicago had a constable for Putnam County. There was no Cook County. Putnam County constable about 1830 something, and then it became the town of Chicago constable, and then it became the city of Chicago constable, and then ultimately we had a police department established about 1855. This was the same, it was after New Orleans and after Cincinnati, and it was about the time of Philadelphia, and it was before Newark and a couple of others. But they were all sort of bunched in that time that we were getting city police departments. Then about, I've already used up most of my time and I have a lot more to go, but I'll try to spin through it quickly. But the most important point is the community point. And Chicago has been a good city because in 1871, they hired the first Afro-American police officer. In 1881, they had their, or thereabouts, their first police matron, a woman. 1891, I believe it was, or thereabouts, I may be off a couple of years, they had the first actual police woman who was paid at the same rate and then same terms as the men, and actually reached the rank of sergeant. In 1918, they had the first black police woman, and they had the first, they then had the black superintendent in the 1980s, and the first Hispanic superintendent in the 1990s. CAPS program, which is really community policing, was about 1992. So there are a lot of other things I could say. As I say, I've already used enough time, but Chicago has in many ways been in the forefront of trying to be a good city in its policing techniques and so forth. But community is what's been lost sight of, and what I think the task force and others are trying to regain. Let me just quickly run through, may run over my time a little bit, let me quickly run through the other 4 points I had, but very quickly. Very important that we separate the military from civil enforcement. It's unfortunate that we talk about the war on drugs and the war on crime, because they should be kept separate. Robert Peel, the reason that the Bobbies had blue uniforms was to make sure that they were distinguished from the military, who in England had red uniforms. And the reason they were unarmed, except for truncheons, was to make sure, again, that they were distinguished from the military, so that the populace didn't feel that their rights were in any danger of being reduced in any way by the government. And it's very important, it goes back to Magna Carta. In Magna Carta, there's a provision in there that no one can be arrested except by his peers. The reason for that was to make sure that the king or whoever didn't come in and arrest people with the army, so that the peers were essentially the equivalent of the sheriff or someone of that nature who was civil in nature. And Charles I lost his head, as you know, during the English Civil War, partly because he disregarded that and he used soldiers. There were other causes too, but he used soldiers again to arrest. And the result with that was the English Civil War, the treason trial, and the only execution of a sovereign that's happened in England. Then in this country, we obeyed the difference until the Civil War. And then we didn't know what to do with the Reconstruction states because they were ambiguous. So the military were brought in to enforce the law in the states being reconstructed. And ultimately, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act, which forbids the military to enforce law in the United States. You may find an exception, say, for instance, for the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard is in the Navy during times of war, and it's under the Treasury Department in times of peace. And it looks out for the drug runners and so forth. So I won't say anything more about that, except that it's very important that we keep the military aspects or any military language, fatigues, military vehicles, all that type of stuff should be kept. If the police are going to use it at all, and we may have to with terrorists and all today, it should be kept in a distinct group of people, like a strategic response team or something that doesn't see the light of day except in very special circumstances. The next thing is reasonableness. I'll skip over all the usual stuff about probable cause. You probably all know about probable cause and articulable suspicion, and I'll just go to deadly force. The Supreme Court has said, and this is what should be written across every policeman's forehead, I suppose, that the exercise of deadly force and the apprehension of a person is actually undercutting the justice system. Because obviously, if someone is accused of committing a crime and you kill them, there's no opportunity for the justice system to work. So therefore, the use of force actually undercuts the very justice system that is the reason for the police, or one of the reasons for the police to exist in the first place. So, and the Supreme Court's been very clear that if someone does not pose a present danger to the police officer or to the public, even if he's escaping, you cannot use deadly force to stop that escape. Because the bottom line is that it's very important that life be preserved. It's it's the first thing mentioned in the Due Process Clause, life, liberty, and it's very important that it be protected. There's one experience I'd like to tell you very quickly that I had when I was in university. I was doing a study on because Gandhi once said that violence can achieve a good in a very short period of time, but the evil it does is lasting for a very, very long period of time. And I was looking into the death penalty, and I found there was a study in the 1920s in Philadelphia that actually saw that when they executed someone, the murder rate in Philadelphia went up for a limited period of time after the execution. And this happened time and time and time again. And the only thing they could think of is that if the state justifies the taking of life, if it legitimizes the taking of life, then certain people, certainly those that are on the edge, will see that as legitimization for them to solve their problems by the taking of life. And obviously the respect of the community actually goes down, it doesn't go up, as we're seeing, when the police take a life in enforcing the law rather than saving the life. Then you have equal protection. Oh, there's one other thing I would like to say about, it's on the border between equal protection and what we were just talking about, reasonableness of deadly force. And that is that the University of Chicago has a study dealing with this, particularly black millennials. But they've done a study of a survey that they've been doing for the last 10 years on an annual basis as to who knows, and it's across all racial groups, who knows who's either been mishandled by the police or who knows of someone who's been mishandled by the police in the terms of being accosted, not mishandled, but generally but accosted. And although the blacks have the highest percentage, it's amazing, the whites are the next highest, and then come the Asians, and at the bottom are the Hispanics. But the Hispanic percentage is 25%, the black percentage is 55%. And the whites and the Asians are in between that. Well, if you've got your lowest group having a 25% reporting that they've been misused, and the whites are claiming it's in the 30-something, I believe, percent, there is someplace a problem with the way people are being approached by the police. And although we see it as a racial problem, it's called a racial problem, it's against the blacks, when you see it more broadly, although they are suffering the most, everyone is suffering from this, and it's something that should be taken note of, and there should be some way of handling this being accosted or attacked by the police generally. There has to be a better way, particularly with all the technology that we have today. Then the last thing I wanted to cover was separation of powers. It was mentioned that there are a lot of problems. There is the unknown or unthought of discrimination, but it's everywhere. You have food deserts. You have other problems with the neighborhoods. You have dilapidated buildings that exist where crime can take place. And my thought is that, again, thinking of the police as guardians and not warriors or guardians, rather than people who are out just to enforce the law, they are guardians of the community. There should be communication from the police to the housing department, or in one way or another, there should be some action on the part of the police. Some of it's through community policing, which is a good way of doing it. Part of it is, I understand the police department now is more foot patrolmen and whatnot in some of these places where there's more personal contact. That's helpful. But there should also be more contact with the city so that you have where there are more plants and more trees, more grass, there tends to be less crime. Where the dilapidated buildings are demolished or boarded up, there's less crime. The police should make it part of their mission to essentially, you might call it social work, but on a low level, some sort of communication to make sure that the neighborhood is looked after. They're doing that to some degree in Chicago with the baseball mentoring that's going on, with the CAPS program, but there should be more of that. Anyway, I've tried to move through as fast as I could, but it's very important. The Constitution has a lot to say. It's different. I take a different view of the Constitution tonight. Everyone knows about the battles that take place in court. They take the Constitution apart. They deconstruct it because someone's looking for a right or looking for a duty, and it's a question of who owes who money or who. But there's another part to the Constitution. You have to look at the Constitution as a holistic document, because that's the way people who have to do the organizing and have to do the actual doing have to function. And it should be seen as a holistic document, and that is the way to learn future course for the actual doing of the tasks. Thank you very much.
One of the recommendations in there, or a statement in the report, is that the commission feels, or the task force feels, that universities have not served the police well, that a better job can be done by higher education to educate officers, particularly at the graduate level. Can you expound upon that and maybe drill down and tell us exactly what that means?
I think one of the key areas that we were talking about there is the area involving history. And the fact of the matter is, it's not just the colleges and universities that have shortchanged police officers. There's a lot in American history that we don't teach in schools. And in particular, the role of police during the civil rights era is something that's really glossed over in most history books and in most curriculums. And it's an area that frankly needs to be focused on more in criminal justice programs to prepare officers or potential officers, people who are going to go into the criminal justice system, maybe even as attorneys at some point, to give them that background and knowledge. You know, the fact of the matter is, whether we choose to talk about it or not, and I'll be honest with you, in case you haven't noticed, there's not a lot of people other than me talking about it. But we need to acknowledge the fact that, you know, law enforcement, we really dropped the ball. We failed during that time. And so if we can't acknowledge that, nobody's going to get past it. Not us, not people in the African American community, or the Hispanic community, or any of the other communities that, you know, we're supposed to be servicing and protecting. And so, you know, there were things that went on during that time period. And if, you know, there's a lot of young people in the room. And if you were starting out as a police officer today, chances are when you got to the academy, you wouldn't have, unless you watched like the movie Mississippi Burning, you wouldn't really have any concept of what the history is, of the perception of police is in the African American community. You just wouldn't, because you wouldn't have been told in your education process, and you wouldn't have been taught it in school. And so one of the things that we're doing in Illinois now, under a new law, Public Act 99-352, which Governor Rauner signed in August. It's a big police reform bill, included body cameras and a lot of mandatory training for basic training, and also annual and in-service training for police officers. Is we're going to make sure that police officers, when they go through basic training, get that history and get that training. And we're going to make sure that those who have already been through basic training pick it up in their in-service training as well. But I think, you know, directly to your point, that was an area where we felt that there was, and we got a lot of testimony in regard to that the programs that are out there kind of didn't prepare folks from that particular aspect.
A related question that's also talked about in the report. The report, if I remember correctly, suggests that police officers should all be college graduates. Would anybody like to respond to that?
I would just say, I'll respond very briefly and just to say that, you know, I think from our perspective, you learn a lot in college, you're exposed to a lot in college in terms of diverse students who may be different, come from different communities than you. I mean, I don't know how many students are in the room. Raise your hand if you're a student here. How many of you are from the city? How many of you are from a smaller suburban town? How many of you are from a small town, or more of a rural town? So you have a pretty wide variety of people here, just in terms of the type of place they're from. And so, you know, what goes along with that is you've got people from rural communities getting to know people who came up in the city in a very metropolitan area. And obviously the racial composition in the room is very diverse. You're exposed to a lot more in college. If you don't have that experience, we think, you know, you're not quite prepared to go out and actually police effectively. So that would be my answer.
Well, there's two schools of thought on that. With the Chicago Police Department, you have to have 60 credits or 2 years of military, and you have to be 21 years of age to be hired in the Chicago Police Department. And 21 is because that's when you can carry a firearm. So we're going to not train people and not be of age. I came on with a high school education, and so I actually go back and look at my story. I came on with a high school education and was able to get my education after I became a police officer up to a master's in public administration. Granted, it took me 25 years to get there, but I made it. But I think it's pretty important that they do have education. Right now, we're kind of balancing. We just went through budget hearings with the city council, And there was arguments from the aldermen, let's scrap the college education because we might be losing minority candidates. So we're trying to create diversity at the same time as in trying to keep standards up. But I really don't think as long as they pass the test, as long as they're able to pass that test, come through our training, I don't see a need, and that's a personal view, a need for the college education if you're able to go through the test, make it through the academy, and you're prepared to go on the street, and we prepare you enough to go on the street. There's other school of thoughts. My superintendent thinks a little different than me, and his word goes, and I follow his suit as far as where we need to be. But we are exploring whether we're going to stay with the college credits or not, and that's really going to be a debate for next year, and we'll see where we go. We're having a test January 13th. In mid-January. Please apply if anybody here wants to become a police officer. We'd love to have you because we're trying to recruit as many people as possible. But you will have to have that college education or military experience before you came on. When we first came to Chicago, and I keep going back to 2011, the requirements is that you could not take the test till you're 21, and then you couldn't be hired till you were 25. And we felt we were losing too many viable candidates being hired at 25, because people are going to start choosing their careers at a lot younger age. So what we did is we moved the test to 18 years of age to take the test. And that maybe they give one of those 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, something to look for as they come out of high school, maybe go back and get that 2-year degree to become a police officer, to keep them busy, and also have something to look forward to. And we won't lose a lot of people that want to choose policing as a career. If you try to get them by the 25, they probably, if they're really good at what they do, they're going to choose something else in life because they got to support their families and begin their life story. So a lot of there's different schools of thought. I really believe that if you get the right candidate, you screen them right, you train them, and you put them on, and you make sure you put the right people on the street that are capable of diversity and also capable of carrying out the job in the right mindset, we'll be okay.
I just want to follow up real quickly on that too, because one of the things that the task force went back to again was we're very much in tune with what the community wants, and so and I think that's really where the rubber meets the road on the issue of college or not. If it's a priority for the community, then I think it's a priority for the department. And some communities will find that it's a barrier, frankly, to getting diverse candidates in their department, and so they may have other requirements other than college.
Would the compromise be to take them without the college education, but make it a requirement and give them the ability to pursue a degree, perhaps on a night school or a reduced basis, whatever, but pursue the degree after they've been hired?
Absolutely. And David, that's exactly where I wanted to go, because Chicago Police Department, like I said, I came from a different department. I'm in my 5th year in Chicago Police Department, but I'd never seen a more educated police department come into Chicago Police, because the City Council also gives benefits to the police officers to draw them in, that you'll pay for your graduate, undergraduate, and graduate degrees, and as long as you maintain a B average. I've interviewed a lot of people who come to my office. I'm surrounded by 3 doctors, 2 lawyers, and someone that has 3 masters. I don't know why you want to have 3 masters, but I'm surrounded by a lot of smart people, a lot of educated people, and I think that would be the trade-off. If we take a look at it, we're going to explore it, but the test is coming up so soon. We already we came down with the age limit coming on at 21, taking the test at 18. We thought that's really going to help us as far as diversity and attracting candidates. And I think our next step is to take a look at the high school education, and then since we offer education, free education for your undergraduate and your graduate degrees in the Chicago Police Department, or the City of Chicago, is better to say, I think that should be one of the things that we should certainly look at, but that's a great suggestion and something we were thinking about.